Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another news rumor video here to discuss. In today's video, we're looking at some injury updates, some waiver updates, some pieces of news, and we've got some trade rumors involving the Kings, the Oilers, the Rangers, and a couple of other teams. We'll touch on all that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe down below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do it without all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below, don't forget to comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, but we're going to try and hit 675 by the trade deadline, so if you can, please leave a subscribe. It really does help out the channel, and don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. I am still a little bit sick, I'm sorry you guys, so if I do sound a little bit raspy, I do apologize, but we do have a very interesting video here today, talking about some very interesting news and rumors. One other thing I want to touch on here quickly is that do not forget to stay tuned for my March 6th trade deadline video. That'll come out on March 6th. I think it'll be around 11:30 Mountain Time. So we're going to do a live stream of the trade deadline over on March 6th. I usually live stream the trade deadline, so if you can, tune into it early March on March 6th on Friday. If you guys can, that would be much appreciated. It would really just help you guys support the channel. Plus, I'd love to talk to you guys when we see a lot of those big trades going down. So definitely, stay tuned for that. But in today's video, there were no signings from our past couple of days. So we'll start off by looking at just a couple of injury updates. Zacha, who's been out for over a week with a lower body injury, will miss the Olympics. And Rondbjerg was injured not this past Sunday, but the Sunday prior with lower body injury, will also miss the Olympics. So bad blows for Team Czechia and Team, I think it's Denmark or Latvia or something like that. To lose Zacha and Rondbjerg, not overly great news there, as both those guys are going to take the Olympic break to recover and then get back with their current teams, which is Boston and Vegas. So very interesting out there. We also have Murchinson, a prospect with the Philadelphia Flyers, who has an upper body injury and has been announced to be out the rest of the season. So not great news there. Murchison was having a pretty good season with the Philadelphia Flyers AHL affiliates, but now he has been ruled out for the rest of the year, so not great news there. But those are only 3 updates when it comes to some injury updates from our past couple of days. Next, going over to some waiver updates, we saw 3 players be placed on waivers. 2 of them for the purpose of contract termination, and no surprise, they both cleared and are now currently UFAs. That's Joshua Davies in Florida and Juho Lammikko in New Jersey. Lammikko, I think, signed a contract this past offseason with the Devils to make his NHL return, but never really was able to amount to anything at the NHL level. So the Devils wound up placing him on unconditional waivers for the purpose of a mutual contract termination. That's exactly what happened, so he's probably going to head back over to Europe. Davies in Florida was actually a prospect of theirs. Obviously, it doesn't seem like it was working out with Florida anyways, so he was placed on unconditional waivers. They mutually agreed to terminate his contract, and now he's a UFA. Wouldn't be surprised if maybe he signed like an AHL level deal. Maybe he signs overseas. I'll have to wait and see on that, but Davies and Lammikko are both placed on unconditional waivers, cleared unconditional waivers, and are now UFAs. Well, Jack Finley was placed on waivers by the Tampa Bay Lightning, and there was actually a waiver claim there that was with the St. Louis Blues. The Blues claimed Finley off of waivers, which is very interesting out there. A lot of people think he's sort of like a young replacement for a guy like Nick Bjugstad, who they just traded. That's a very likely possibility. Finley has been sort of like a healthy scratch, 4th line guy type player for the Tampa Bay Lightning this year. I could see him, especially if the Blues move a couple of players out, be like a decent 4th line center for that St. Louis Blues team and really start to grow with them. So this isn't a bad pickup here in my opinion. Finley's making, I think, under $1 million. So like, this is not a bad pickup, and if it doesn't work, they can place him on waivers again. So very interesting note there, but Finley has been claimed off waivers from the Tampa Bay Lightning by the St. Louis Blues, and Lammikko and Davies are now UFAs, so very interesting note there. Next, going on to just a few quick updates here, and give some pieces of news. The Panthers pick, apparently, this wasn't a report when the trade happened last year, but when Seth Jones was traded to the Florida Panthers by the Chicago Blackhawks, and the Hawks got a 1st round pick in return, the 1st round pick was actually top 10 protected. A lot of people were assuming that this was a non-protected first round pick because it was never mentioned by any of the insiders that was a top 10 protected pick. And then out of the blue last week, I think it just was announced that it was a top 10 protected pick. So apparently some of the insiders missed that. So if the Florida Panthers do have a top 10 pick, they will wind up retaining it and not having to deal it to Chicago. So very, very interesting note there, as the Florida Panthers will be able to keep their pick if it is in the top 10. So very interesting note there. Because of Zacha and Rondbjerg now missing the Olympics, Chalapik and Sedkov were both named to the Olympics. Sedkov has been playing over in the Denmark League, so he's been having some good options over in Denmark. Chalapik, I think, has been playing over in Czechia. So once again, they're not NHLers, but because of those two guys both leaving, they had to replace them with someone. So Chalapik and Sedkov are both entering the Olympic rosters for Czechia and Denmark. So very interesting out there. Michael McCarron was fined $2.3 thousand for slashing, I think it was Trevor Van Riemsdyk, back over on Thursday last week. So once again, that was, I think, the last day of NHL action. So McCarron has been fined. So very interesting note there, and hopefully he doesn't do that again. So very interesting note there. Crosby has been named the captain for Team Canada at the Olympics. Not too surprising there. McDavid and McCarron were named the A's. So those are going to be your leaders for Team Canada. For the States, they named Matthews as team captain, and they named, I think it was Matthew Tkachuk and McAvoy, assistant captains. I might be wrong on that, but those are your leadership groups for the States and the Canadians going forward. So very interesting note there, as the States and Canada have both announced their captains. So very interesting note there. One last thing before I get to the trade rumor portion of the video, as the Islanders' top prospect and recent first-round pick Victor Eklund, who's currently playing in the SHL, has announced that he'll be coming to North America next year. So whether that's playing at the NHL level or getting some experience time at the AHL level, Eklund will leave the SHL after this year, and he'll be joining the Islanders either at the NHL level or the AHL level, but either way, he will turn pro. So very interesting note there. Eklund's having a pretty good season, I think, over in the SHL, so he's going to get some pretty good playing time at the NHL or AHL level. So very interesting note there. But those are all the updates from our past couple of days. Lastly, we're going over to a couple of trade rumors. We got 4 trade rumors here to talk about, 4 very interesting trade rumors. We're going to start off with the Nashville Predators. So first, Elliot Friedman was talking about the Nashville Predators recently, and he mentions that name he keeps on forgetting, but it's recently been mentioned to him that has a very likely chance to get traded, is Jonathan Marchessault. Now, Marchessault has come up at some points over the past couple of months. He's got this year plus 3 more seasons left on his current contract, a $5.5 million cap hit. It isn't a terrible cap hit, given what some of the other Predators guys have, and it seems like Marchessault really wants a fresh start. It seems that both the Predators and Marchessault are trying to work together to find a solution, so there is a very likely chance, even though Marchessault, I think, does have some trade protection, that a deal could get done before the trade deadline. Now, he's a really solid middle 6'4". I don't think he's a top 6'4" anymore, but I do think he's a really solid middle 6 forward. He has veteran experience. He won a cup with the Vegas Golden Knights, so he knows what it takes to win. I could see a lot of teams that have some interest in him. 3 years after this year at $5.5 million for a guy who can still put you up between like 20 and 25 goals and around like 50 points. That isn't half bad. So like, I definitely think they could get something from Marchessault. I'm not sure if it'll be the greatest return because it is still a pretty high cap hit for aging forward. But I think like a 2nd round pick and a decent prospect, or like a 3rd round pick and a really good prospect, maybe like a young roster player back in return, I think it's attainable for the Nashville Predators. And it seems like Marchessault really does want a fresh start. So I do think we'll see a trade for Marchessault before the trade deadline. It has been known that he might want to go to a no-tax state. So a team like maybe Dallas could have some interest. Seattle with a reunion with Vegas lineup. Maybe Montreal. There's been some connections to Montreal too. There's probably a couple other teams out there too he might consider as well. So very interesting note there. But keep your eye on Marchessault. That seems like he wants a fresh start. And with the Preds still looking to be like sellers come the trade deadline, he could definitely get moved. So I have to keep our eye on him. Next, going over to the LA Kings. Ken Holland recently, I think, was doing an interview talking about his acquisition of Artemi Panarin, and he mentioned that they have a surplus of wingers. So he says a guy like Warren Foegele might be a guy who they have to move out. So that's very interesting out there. Foegele was acquired a couple of off seasons ago in free agency. He's been a really solid player. Last year's first season in Los Angeles was phenomenal. Looked really good. I think I had a career high in goals, close to a career high in points. I had a really good plus minus. So like he was doing phenomenal for the Los Angeles Kings. But this year he's been a healthy scratch a couple of times, only had I think like 8 or 9 points, and he hasn't really been the sort of player that he was in Los Angeles last year. So with the acquisition of Panarin, that probably bumps Foegele down to like a 4th line winger, and paying like a 4th line winger $3.5 million for this year and next year just doesn't make a whole bunch of sense for Los Angeles. So they might be able to trade from a position of strength and move Foegele. There'll be a lot of teams that have some interest in him. There's been some recent talk about him going back to Edmonton. I know there's definitely going to be a couple other teams that have some interest who try and acquire Warren Foegele. He's a guy who can put up a couple of goals, he can put up a couple of points, he can play really solid 3rd line minutes, and I think there would be teams out there, even as Capit, who would have some serious interest in Warren Foegele. So we'll have to wait and see on that. No guarantees by any means that Foegele does get moved, but I definitely think it's very, very likely after the Artemi Panarin addition. And with all mentioning that they probably need to move on at least one winger, it seems like Foegele might be that guy. So we'll have to keep an eye on Warren Foegele going forward, as there's a really likely chance he could get moved. So I have to wait and see on that. Next, we went over to Chris Johnston. He was talking about Vincent Trocheck. And when talking about Trocheck, he mentioned that Trocheck is likely to get dealt before this year's trade deadline. Now, there's a couple of different layers to that. Johnston does say that the Rangers are very likely to go through retool mode. We've already talked about the letter that they gave out. They've moved Susie, they moved Panarin. Those are 2 main guys because they're Pagnotta phase. But there's still other guys they could trade. There's been a whole bunch of talk about Lafreniere. There's been some talk about young defenseman Brayden Schneider. And Trocheck's another guy who's been out there. Now, Trocheck is a center. One of the things that a lot of teams are looking for right now is a center. Trocheck last year had a little bit of a down season. This year's on pace for close to 70 points, and he's still one of the best face-off men in the entire NHL. So with all those things going for him, there's a very likely chance he gets moved. He's still got, I think, a couple of years left after this year at a $5 million or just over $5 million cap hit. So it's not overly expensive, and I definitely think there'd be teams out there who would have some interest in Trocheck. Now, Trocheck does have a little bit of control. Trocheck used to have a full no movement clause. He doesn't have that anymore, but he does still have some control over where he goes. He currently has a 12-team no-trade list that will go down in coming years, but he does still have some protection of where he goes. It seems like he'd rather stay east instead of going west, so it might make landing spots like Detroit or Carolina more likely than landing spots like Los Angeles or Minnesota, but he doesn't have full control. It's only 12 teams he can block. So I'll have to see on that, but it definitely seems like with the amount of teams looking for center help, with Trocheck being a very likely trade candidate, with the Rangers where they are right now, it seems like a Trocheck deal is likely to come before this year's trade deadline. And I think, like I just said, Detroit, Carolina, maybe some other teams out east who need some center help might be the sort of front runners for him. And I could see the Rangers get like a 1st-round pick, decent prospect, maybe a roster player, get those sorts of things back in a sort of Trocheck deal. So I have to wait and see on that, but keep your eye on Vincent Trocheck. Very likely chance he gets moved, and even though he does have some trade protection, we'll have to wait and see where he goes, but Trocheck does seem like a very likely chance to get dealt. And lastly, David Pagnotta was talking about the Edmonton Oilers and the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he says that those 2 teams have been talking about potential deal, but unlike a lot of people have been expecting, it's not about Bobby McMann. He says that he thinks that those 2 teams have been talking about a trade involving Nick Waugh and Oliver Ekman-Larsson. This would be a very interesting deal. It seems like the Oilers want like a 3rd line forward before the trade deadline, and maybe like a shutdown sort of defenseman for their either top 4 or on their 3rd pair. So that's sort of the goals for the Oilers for this year's trade deadline. And Waugh and Oliver Ekman-Larsson makes some sense. Now, how they would pull that off cap-wise, I have no idea, because I'm not sure if the Leafs will be willing to retain on both those guys, and combined their AAV sinks to like $6.5 million. Even if they move Mangiapane, that's not going to be enough to get both those guys. So I don't know how they do that cap-wise, but still, it's a very interesting concept. Was the team's 3rd line center for the Edmonton Oilers would be great, because then you'd be able to play Draisaitl on the wing. You can have RNH as your 2nd line center, or you can have RNH on the wing, have Draisaitl as your 2nd line center. That would make a ton of sense for the Oilers, having Waugh as your 3rd liner, or you could have Waugh on a wing, because Waugh is a very versatile guy. Oliver Ekman-Larsson's not the greatest shutdown defenseman. He's more of an offensive defenseman, but he can play a shutdown sort of role. I don't think it'd be the greatest fit in Edmonton, but I could definitely see him bolster that defense. So as a Knights fan, I hope the Leafs do no business with the Edmonton Oilers, and I hope that they move those guys, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Nick Waugh, they do move them to other teams, because I do not like the Edmonton Oilers and them getting better. Just don't want to see that. But it seems like they are talking about a trade, and maybe a trade involving Nick Waugh and Oliver Ekman-Larsson might be in the cards. But if the Leafs are already asking for a first-round pick for Bobby McMann, like we talked about recently, what are they asking from the Edmonton Oilers if they're going to move Waugh and Oliver Ekman-Larsson who both have term? Like, they could probably ask for like a first-round pick, the Oilers' top prospect, maybe a couple of roster players. Like, I don't know exactly what would happen, but very interesting note there. That's an interesting concept. Would really help out the Edmonton Oilers. I'll let you guys thoughts on that down in the comment section below. I could see it happen. I just don't know where the cap space is coming for the Edmonton Oilers. So very interesting note there. But that's all I'm going to talk for today. I left you guys thoughts. Do the Edmonton Oilers and Maple Leafs take up on a deal involving OEL? Do the Rangers move Vincent Trocheck before a trade deadline? Do the Preds move Jonathan Marchessault before a trade deadline? And do the LA Kings move Warren Foegele before a trade deadline? Definitely thoughts on all of that, plus all the news updates, waivers, injuries, and all that other stuff down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk for today. Remember to like this video. If you're listening, subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do it with all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming on in the very near future. Also, a blog about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so you can check that out. I'll link to that in the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.